So I wanted to talk about the Maxroll tier list that you very well may have seen in the past. Obviously it's right here. I'll include a link to them. There's been a lot of changes just based off how the meta has developed. And I want to specifically talk about the Necromancer because it's the only ding dang class that I know anything about. But obviously a lot of my experience with the Necromancer goes into how we end up tiering these classes in these lists. I obviously talk with both Dark Humility and Echo Hack, who have been putting in a ton of hours on the Necromancer as well. And then I'll just kind of like throw my ideas out to the team in general. But I want to kind of touch on why the Necromancer classes have been moving in the ways that they have, just in case you were looking for some insight. And I didn't want you to think like, oh no, something moved down, my build must be trash. That's really not what it is. It's just coming to like have a better understanding of how these builds all work in comparison to one another, the more hours that I put into each individual type of build. So here we have the Nightmare Dungeon push tier list. Pretty straightforward, right? Builds that can successfully push towards tier 100 Nightmare dungeons effectively and who are able to run those dungeons effectively. This requires you to be able to do the dungeons at all, needs you to be able to do them like efficiently or quickly with good survivability and not necessarily always having to fish for like exact perfect affixes. Now, most builds on tier 100 literally need to have like a perfect dungeon with perfect affixes and things that like just do not affect them at all. So that's obviously one of the factors. But in general, builds here are being judged off of how well they can accomplish this on average. So obviously Bone Spear has been making a huge splash, and I will admit I used to think that Bone Spirit was the only good Nightmare Dungeon pushing build until the Infinimist had been like innovated upon. Again, shoutouts to Necromancer, who like super popularized how the build looks in the modern day. But it turns out that there are a couple different builds that are much better than Bone Spirit. Most notably Bone Spear, it's huge, it does a ton of damage, it's able to like push through while min-maxing damage, and it basically survives by killing things before they can get to it to kill you. The Infinimist Necromancer is also very good at pushing in Nightmare Dungeons. Its primary issue is that it just doesn't do it as fast as a Bone Spear Necromancer. While it's effectively unkillable, when you come out of Blood Mist, you still need to be able to cast Decrepify and Corpse Tendrils and sometimes Reap, and in those circumstances, you might get got. We like to pretend that Infinimist is just like permanently invulnerable to damage, and that's just absolutely not the case. Where it really starts to slow down is against like really tanky elite monsters and bosses. So while it will eventually kill them, it's that keyword eventually, so it's just not as fast as Bone Spear. Then you'll notice that Bone Spirit dropped way down. This is my baby, it's my favorite build ever, and I just had to admit the fact that right now the meta doesn't exist that really supports Bone Spirit. Bone Spirit does 50 million damage crits. Most monsters don't survive a 50 million damage crit. You might go, well, cool, awesome kill speed, except it has all of the same like slow setup of Infinimist, but without any of its survivability, and it has arguably very similar damage to Bone Spear, but it does it once, and if everything isn't dead, it's screwed. So realistically, it's just not that good for Nightmare Dungeon pushing. It's not a terrible build for it, it's just going to be slow and a bit clunkier. And then we have Sever currently down in C tier. I think that like Sever in basically every darkness build that doesn't just fully commit to Infinimist is going to be fine. Blight will also do pretty well here once the Blight guide is written. Blight also has a bit more survivability, but slightly worse damage output, so it's kind of like go a little bit faster or go a little bit slower, but be able to survive better. And then you'll see that we have a couple builds that aren't currently written yet for the Necromancer. So we have Pure Blood Necromancer. I currently have this in C tier, and if you didn't see my most recent video about just kind of how Blood is working right now, it's because the build completely lags out the server that you're on whenever you use Bloodlance, completely borking the game in general. You just kind of can't do anything because of the aspect that it allows it to spawn a ton of additional Bloodlances. So if and when they fix it, this build will probably shoot up this tier list, I assume somewhere around A, because its damage clear speed just isn't that high, but it's ridiculously tanky, except the other end, so it gets like full Fortify and 25,000 maximum life and full barrier, etc. And then we also have Pure Summon Necro in the C tier. Here's the issue with this build that I see right now. Pure Summon Necro is Ring of Men down. There's no way to get around it. When I get this build guide written, even though I would like to be able to make it so that your minions are doing damage, it's the ring doing the damage. Now you might see other people like clearing high nightmare dungeons, and that's super awesome. One of the issues is that it's also revolving around a bug with Bone Prison. Bone Prison is just proccing Lucky Hit at 100% of the time, even if you don't use any aspects with it. This has been known for a while, like you would cast Bone Prison and would spawn a corpse, even though you didn't deal damage, and you'd be like, why did that happen? Weird. And just kind of moved on. It's been reported to the developers. But since it's relying on this buggy interaction with Bone Prison, I'm really hesitant to put it higher up in the tier list because it's inevitably going to get like nerfed into the ground. And I think Ring of Mendeln is also a really big contender for getting nerfed into the ground. So that's just the reason why it's not there right now. Now, I also considered Pure Blood to run both Blood Surge and Blood Lance, and even potentially Blood Wave, and it turns out you just kind of don't actually do that. And so that's why you'll see Blood Lance and Blood Surge down here in the D tier, even though they have moved up. I think that Blood Lance actually kind of replaces Pure Blood up here, and again, might shoot all the way up to the top. And then Blood Surge just doesn't really have the damage for killing stuff efficiently like Blood Lance. Ultimately, this is going to be a very low tier build here, but that's just the reason why they're there right now. It's because, one, we got to get Blood Lance up there post bug fix, and then we'll kind of worry about what shape of Blood Necromancer fits into each one of these different tiers. Speed farming relates to doing anything that really isn't in a Nightmare Dungeons. This is open world content, Hell Tides, going and doing like just killing like huge density very quickly. You don't typically have to worry about boss kill speed, but even that is like a little bit of a factor when you're talking about events and Hell Tides. This is quickly farming very easy content for your build in particular, and like maxing out all the stats that say you are more efficient as opposed to having to worry about damage. So that's why you'll see that like a lot of builds actually do pretty well in speed farming, because it turns out you don't need a ton of damage to go do the Hell Tide. What you need is mobility, resource generation, and just like a modicum of survivability, and you can just kind of go full blast. Obviously here, Bone Spear is the best build. It's the fastest Necromancer build. It clears stuff the fastest. It does a ton of damage without even needing to stack damage, and you can just worry like purely about essence generation, so you don't have to even like spend time casting Corpse Explosion or anything. You can just run and gun Bone Spear the entire time. It's obvious that this is like by far the fastest Necromancer build for all forms of speed farming. You'll notice that Infinimist actually dropped like a pretty decent amount here. And there's just a reality that we have to accept, that while Infinimist is incredibly fast, right? It can use Ghostwalker, it doesn't get slowed down by Blood Mist. It just doesn't kill things in the same volume and at the same speed as Bone Spear. So while it itself is pretty fast, it takes a little bit of time to set up, it then immediately nukes the monsters, but you've cast like 3 or 4 different spells when Bone Spear has literally just clicked Bone Spear and continued to move forward. And then if you start to look at all the builds that are in S and A tier, you start to see like the heavy hitters from all of the other classes. And across the board, Infinimist just does not compare to any of these other builds. Like it just doesn't teleport like the Sorceress. It isn't a rogue. It's not Whirlwind Barbarian, right? It just really can't compare to these things. Bone Spear can only barely keep up because you can hit the 200% movement speed max cap. So while you don't have like a big mobility skill that can teleport you somewhere, you're at least running at max speed near 100% of the time. So here in B tier, you'd also find the Blood Surge Necromancer once we have that endgame guide written. It's really good for density farming because it hits the entire screen, and when it overpowers, it can basically kill everything that isn't in a Nightmare Dungeon. It's a little bit slower than Infinimist because it literally can't stack as much mobility, with also having a ton of cooldown to be able to permanently Blood Mist, but it's close because Blood Mist will, obviously get cooldown reduction from overpowering, but it's just a little bit slower there. Ultimately, you can basically put every single blood build here, so like Pure Blood here, Blood Surge, or Blood Lance, although I do think that Blood Lance is just like much worse at speed farming than Blood Surge is, again, because monsters just roll over like dried paper. You really don't need that much damage, and Blood Lance basically overkills while needing to set up multiple overpowers to get it done. In C tier, you have Sever Necromancer. Again, Blight Necromancer will be right up here as well. They're basically the same build for speed farming. And then oddly enough, Bone Spirit has dropped down pretty low. Again, Bone Spirit will one-shot everything. It's doing 50 million damage crits to monsters that would have died to 200,000 damage. So there's no real way for it to get like a huge amount of clear speed out of it, unless you very specifically swap over to the speed farming version, which is using Blood Artisan's Cuirass, and it's generating a ton of blood orbs and then just casting a bunch of Bone Spirits very quickly and for free. And in that case, you can speed it up, but it's nowhere near Infinimist. It's not going to be anywhere near Blood Surge hitting the entire screen, and obviously it's nowhere near Bone Spear. So this also had to come down. Like I said, you have Blood Lance down here. Blood Lance could probably move up a little bit, again, after the bug with the aspect is fixed, but realistically, it just pales in comparison to Blood Surge or like a Pure Blood build, and it's just a little bit too niche and does a little bit too much damage in too small of an area. And then down here, we have Pure Summons. Oddly enough, Pure Summons kills things pretty decently quickly. The issue being that it doesn't really have the mobility of Bone skills, so it doesn't gain Wind Striker, getting a ton of crits off either, and it really can't slot in a lot of the things that you need to make Blood Mist into a true mobility skill. So in these ways, it also just has like a lot of setup. It needs the minions to go hit the monsters so that the Mendeln Ring can actually proc and then kill them. While the kill speed isn't too bad, mobility is and the setup is. So realistically, I think it's just like F tier compared to every other class. And what you really need to understand about the endgame tier list is what endgame is really defining. everybody's going to have a different definition of endgame. We're trying to use Blizzard's own definition of endgame. Endgame is from 50 to 100, post-campaign, and everything in between. So this includes Nightmare dungeon pushing. It includes just running typical dungeons for cleaning out your renown. It includes doing Tree of Whispers, doing Hell Tides. While the speed farming tier list is going to do very similar things here, this is talking about doing everything in general. So it's also going to include like farming in the PvP zone. It's going to include world boss kill speed. It's every single end game activity that you can possibly think of. And when we're thinking about these builds, we're trying to better understand how they rank up against each other for being able to do as many things as possible at a high level of competency and competition. So in the S tier, we already had Bone Spear Necromancer. It really can't move anywhere. Bone Spear just kind of excels at all content. It can run fast, it do big damage. So not a lot of like confusing aspects there. But you also notice that at first we had Infinimist in S tier and we've moved that down to A tier. Again, just in general, how it kind of compares to other S tier builds in the game, which is like the most notable difference here, right? Barbarians, Druids, Rogues, even Sorceresses in their mobility skills, while they're not nearly as like high damage or high impact as some of the Necromancer builds, we really need to start looking at Infinimist from like a much finer lens and really hold it under some scrutiny here, because while again, it's typically immune to most damage most of the time, except when it has to cast other abilities, it isn't that fast. It does struggle against single targets. And even if you go with, increasing its critical strike damage, like Nicobon has been innovating, and like you've seen a little bit on the Infinimist build that I had, just doesn't really compare to other S tier builds. So it had to come down and it sits more comfortably in A tier in comparison to all of the other amazing A tier builds that are here for doing all content in the game. In the B tier, you'll also notice that Bone Spirit has come down a whole bunch, which really stinks. Bone Spirit is good at a ton of different types of content because it one-shots whatever it walks up to. I just don't think that there's a meta that exists or a content that exists that really benefits the damage output of Bone Spirit. It's ultimately just like a clunkier and like more condensed version of Bone Spear, or a slightly higher single target damage version of Infinimist. It just doesn't really do anything that the game needs it to do at this point, other than getting the biggest damage number on the board that the Necromancer can see. Also in the B tier, we have Sever, as well as Blight Necromancer when that build guide is written. These are great. They're like one step removed from Infinimist. They have slightly better either control of monsters, with Blight being able to like permanently spam Blight, and Sever just has like better single target damage than Infinimist, but it loses out on some of like the overall efficiency gains and survivability gains, so they're not going to be as strong builds, but they're pretty damn near close. In the C tier, we have a couple interesting inclusions here. We do have Blood Surge Necromancer. I think that ultimately Bloodlance should probably also come up here. My only issue, again, Bloodlance is currently bugged. It really doesn't work. There are a lot of different types of content that don't just need like really big overpower like damage spikes into a single target, and would much rather have area of effect damage to be able to clear out a ton of things more quickly. So this is where Blood Surge, I think, still like actively outputs slightly better overall functionality than Bloodlance, but the moment that you start looking at like Nightmare dungeon pushing, obviously Bloodlance is going to start like rapidly ascending that list in comparison to other versions of Blood builds. And then you have Pure Summoner here in C tier as well. Pure Summoner does just do really good across the majority of content. It can do bosses, it can do density clearing. If you throw, obviously once you have the Mendel ring on it, it can clear pretty effectively. It's got a good amount of tankiness. Now that you can actually direct your skeletons to engage without you directly generating aggro, it has a lot more of that survivability that we kind of hope for on a Pure Summoner build. Ultimately, it's held back by one, it's relying on a bug with Bone Prison. At the end of the day, minions just don't do damage themselves. They're kind of just proc puppets. So it's not going to get much higher up on this list, because even though it can do all of this content, and you might have a good time doing all of this content on it, it's just not great in comparison to the vast majority of other builds. So there's a couple different things holding it back. But ultimately, these are where the Necromancer builds kind of line up on, if you're just trying to do as many endgame things as possible, you have a lot of really good options. We have S tier, A tier, B tier, and heck, the majority of them are even in C tier. So if you're looking just for like good overall builds, this is a nice list to check out, just so you can be like, oh, okay, this one's going to do pretty well. But I don't want you to think that just because maybe your Bloodlance Necro is down here, that it's necessarily a bad build. I think it's a good build. It's just probably not great at the majority of things that you may want to do with it, and ultimately is very finicky. But when we're talking about a leveling tier list, we're talking about whatever Necromancer build is going to feel the best getting up to level 50 and then later on pushing to level 100, but that's when you get more into like the endgame tier list for different endgame activities. But when we're talking about leveling, we're really talking about like, does it have good mobility? Does it have good clear speed? Can it handle density as well as bosses whenever you're running dungeons? And can it ultimately handle like its essence generation really well? Do you have good tools? Is it super expensive to get into, or does it need like very specific aspects? Or can you kind of deal with just the Codex of Power? So you're going to see builds here that probably aren't going to surprise you, but ultimately we're also trying to rank up against just every other class and every other build in the game. So the Necromancer isn't going to be the best leveling class in general. That's, typically the Sorceress and the Rogue, because they have all the mobility and really good damage and they're able to stack it very easily. But in the A tier, you have Bone Spear Necromancer at the top of the A tier. It's really good. It's not that difficult to like manage your essence on it once you've gotten the flow for the Necromancer. It puts out a ton of damage. It has really good mobility. It's able to stack Wind Striker, which is in the Codex of Power, Splintering in the Codex of Power, Grasping Veins in the Codex of Power. It's even able to pick up like Potent Blood to be able to get Bone Storm down easier. It has Umbral in the Codex of Power. Bone Spear has just like so many tools in the Codex of Power. That's what really helps to amp up its overall like leveling experience and how easy it is to get into power. And then similarly, you have Sever and Blight, which also have Blighted in the Codex of Power. You're kind of seeing a trend here. These builds are going to do pretty well in comparison to Bone Spear. One of the things about Bone Spear, though, is that it can apply vulnerables so easily. It also makes it really good for playing with other people, because especially in the early game, most builds can't apply vulnerable 100% of the time. But once you have Splintering aspect on a weapon, you just apply vulnerable for your whole team. So while the leveling tier list doesn't necessarily look at group play as well, a lot of people would like to level up together, and here's where Bone Spear kind of shines in the early game. In the B tier, you have Blood Surge. Blood Surge is great. Its only real issue is that it doesn't do single target damage. Luckily, you're able to use and rely on minions in the early game because they don't necessarily fall over immediately, and this helps to generate more corpses, generate more essence, be able to stack vulnerable more easily if you want to, and then you're able to use that to like power through some fights that would have been a slog without minions available to it. But that's why it's actually above like a pure Summoner Sever build, because it just has so much more AoE damage available to it, that while the Summoner Sever build like is mostly a Sever build, but it more so relies on the minions, tries to focus on the minions, that damage is much more targeted and pointed. It's better at killing a boss, and it's at killing like big waves of monsters, and Blood Surge just kind of ekes out that little additional benefit, as well as having slightly better survivability just from being able to fortify and heal a lot more. So as a pure summoner down here in D tier, just kind of relying on your minions eventually killing stuff for you, obviously that isn't great. Also, while you're leveling, you can't assume that you have a Ring of Men down. Most of us don't. I hear people complaining that they still don't have one. They're level 100. I personally have like sold and salvaged 10. Sorry. I'm sorry. That was ill-hearted. I'm very sorry. I do apologize. I have, like, it is true. I have salvaged like 10 of them, but you don't need to feel bad about that. I apologize for that. But ultimately, just waiting for your minions to be able to kill stuff before you have like really good gear and being able to rely on Ring of Men down, it just don't do that great. And then for leveling, Bloodlance is absolutely trash. You basically need 1,000 aspects. Half of them are not inside of the Codex of Power or are not strong enough in the Codex of Power to really warrant being used. And Bloodlance is just kind of trash in comparison to everything else until you're in the end game and have like near perfect gear, like you might have seen in my most recent build guide video covering the topic. But there you go. I just wanted to cover that tier list in general to give you some insight again on why we're making those changes in the standings as far as Necromancer builds are concerned. I hope that answered any questions. I've been personally getting a lot of questions, and I've been seeing some on Reddit and in the Discord being like, oh, why did this build move? Did it get worse? Did something get nerfed, etc.? Just wanted to give you that insight. It's more so an appreciation of the builds and how they function, and getting better experience with them allows me to have better insight and allows me to work better with Echo Hack and Dark Humility to share their insights, to generally figure out, where do these builds realistically line up, especially in comparison to other classes. But again, I hope that helps. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.